Gentlemen, if you want to step onto the floor there, and we will start sort of an open discussion. Or you're welcome to sit on the stage if you'd like. Just maybe a little bit more room to move around.
I'll stand.
Let's go mingle.
Yeah. So what I wanted to start the discussion with was just basically what our experience has been that a lot of our customers' implementations are driven by a tactical requirement. There's something that the organization needs to achieve immediately. There's a project that has a deadline, that has a budget, has a sponsor, and it needs to be addressed. And for a lot of those, as you can see here on this particular slide, what we're representing is the federated access to applications on one side of the line, and then the back side to make that all work with Radiant Logic, federating your identity and bringing your identity sources together. So I'll just have you, each of you can in turn, sort of mention or cover what was the impetus, what was the first reason that really brought the Radiant Logic product into your fold, and how did that first initial challenge get addressed in your environment?
Sure.
And Carlos, if you want to start.
Sure. Yeah, for us, we got Radiant Logic, and we saw the need for a virtual directory at the early onset of creating our identity provider. The attributes that are used to do a lot of the various authorization for all the different relying parties are not in a very centralized manner. And so the virtual directory was really able to give us a common policy information point. So as any application comes in to get authenticated through our IDP LDAP, they use the PIP that front-ended through VDS to really do that authorization. So that was just the motivator. We had to do it. There was no way we're going to be able to get those identities consolidated because we had such a different spectrum of different relying parties, and we didn't want to get into data synchronization. We didn't want to be owners of the data. We wanted the data to stay where it's at, its authoritative sources, but of course we needed to expose it for all of our PDPs to be able to leverage it for its authorization decisions.
Excellent. And Rob, do you want to give a little overview of what brought Radiant into your environment?
Sure, no problem. Ours was like the opposite. We have, again, we're usually internally facing. So we have only our internal customers, i.e. our logons, that kind of thing. We bring in together in general, we have an IDR. We call it infrastructure, but it's identity repository, where we're bringing together our HR and our Active Directory, bring them together. And we're fronting it right now with an ADLDS, but what we're trying to do is bring in VDS to front that. And that's for security purposes and all that. But to create that IDR, we actually synchronize, so I've been thinking about it over the last little while about not synchronizing, but instead just taking VDS, putting the rules within VDS, leaving the repositories as they are, rather than synchronizing it and just creating the view. So that's the initial use case for us for VDS.
Okay, excellent. And Steve, if you can give us sort of, for your experience in terms of you're very familiar with the space, what is driving this in organizations you've worked with in the past, and what seems to be the big tactical first low-hanging fruit, as they say?
Yeah, well, Wade, I think in threes. If there's a fourth or a fifth reason, they're probably important, but you don't get enough time to address those. But the number one reason that I've seen it brought into prior places of employment have been due to the accelerated rate of adoption, so speed. We needed in the past, there was a need to have a solution that could be brought up and see time to value and measured in months, not years. So, there's very real need when you bring in a tool like this that you identify one or two key stakeholders, but then once you start advertising this capability, a lot of people just line up because they want to use it. And if it's not something that you can implement quickly, their interest is going to wane, and you're going to lose that opportunity to see economies of scale and leverage to bring them on board. Another reason is really because of the scale, right? You want to be able to leverage that and extend these standardized services, and you don't want to scale what's broken. You don't want to continue to allow or push identity silos broadly across the organization. So whether that is a team through a merger and acquisition that wants to synchronize or migrate their identities into a corporate directory, or if you want to federate identities, you kind of want to look at an opportunity to have the same team that gets the solution out there to the largest number of addressable use cases. So, you know, the identity silos was a really big problem. And then governance, you know, once the thing is there and once you have a lot of applications that are on board with this kind of solution, your GRC team, your InfoSec team will thank you and they'll send you birthday wishes or whatever. They'll really appreciate the fact that you've greatly simplified the infrastructure. You give them one place to look when they're ingesting log data for forensics or for advanced threat detection and monitoring, or you know, when it comes to you know, SOX and audit, there's generally, you know, fewer places that you have to look to demonstrate how users are getting into your system and how their access is being provisioned and how it's being revoked.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so that takes us from the tactical reason, what brought us into, or brings the solution into many of the customers. What we also noticed is, though, after that's taken place, what we see is sort of a metamorphosis, that once the organization, the people, the developers, the business owners start to find out the capabilities of the product, its ability to deliver on those particular functions, it drives a much bigger wave of adoption. And that adoption can almost become a strategic platform within the organization. And what Radiant Logic does is really provide that strategic foundation underneath each of your different silos of identity provisioning, identity access management, governance, and is that abstraction layer between all the sources of identity behind the scenes. So going back to Carlos, in terms of your environment, and after you got your initial sort of wave of implementation there, what did you see from your organization, and how did the uptake start to spread?
Sure. I mean, the biggest driver continues to be our cloud implementation. It just becomes, you know, anything that we get, we turn into a service, and you know, we use it to the best of its capabilities. But yes, having, you know, virtual directory at your disposal certainly, you know, helps as you look at other things within the enterprise that in the past wouldn't have justified a purchase on its own, but having the service available now, you're able to go back and address certain issues. So a lot of the more traditional, creating a common view with Active Directory and LDAP for enterprise consumption, those are some of the things that, you know, all of a sudden became doable, and that we started, you know, expanding the use of it for. And other things as well. I'm trying to think of a particular use case right now, but you know, sometimes the business is more excited about the capabilities than yourself. And we've had some cases of use cases where, you know, our manager of the LDAP team who owns the service had to do things that Radiant Logic supports that were not part of the scope of what we wanted to do. But you know, at the end of the day, you solve what the business wants. And he's not here right now, but he's floating around, so if anybody has some specific Radiant Logic implementation questions of what we've done, I'll connect you with him.
Okay, excellent. And Rob?
I guess for the, you know, it follows a build it and they will come type model. We talked about that a little bit this morning. Once a product becomes core in the environment, you get the architects, you get the business seeing, all right, now what else can it be used for? And we bring it in for this VDS, this nice view and everything, but it's much more powerful than that. And once people start reading up on it, now we're getting requests for proxy authentication from the DMZ, for example, right? Little thing, we call it little things. Others products can do it, but it's already there and it's core. So the architects say, all right, we're going to use it for this. So proxy authentication, we can do and securing your existing LDAP, so almost like a role, like having different views for different people, for different groups, rather than this one flat LDAP that everybody has access to. Now you have these one flat LDAP, which is given all these different views, so you only get the C attributes that you're given access to. I mean, so that's, you know, all those little, like, you know, it is those things, you build it, they will come. There's way more that this is capable of, and there's way more that I have in mind. Even for migrating off of, like, we have a whole bunch of Sun 1 LDAPs, migrating off of Sun 1, putting this in the middle so that the applications don't know any different, but then you can lose the Sun 1 LDAP on the back, right? Little things, I call it little things because they are just little things, but they're small steps to moving to your environment to make it less complicated.
Excellent, thank you. And Steve, from a broader perspective, if you see a strategic platform like this implemented, what does it mean to an organization, and how do
Yeah, well,
people leverage that?
The little things are adding up to a lot of great value that these guys have mentioned. You know, in working with you, Wade, in the past, and also just looking out at the opportunities. Heck, we've been able to, you like to take this opportunity to not have to retool for every single use case. Okay, so you've provisioned a user. So now how are you going to provision his access? So, I've actually, worked with the Radiant Logic team and able to prove, integrating an identity provisioning event into Office 365 with provisioning his access based upon, business rules, from, whether his, that's group-based or rule-based, you can provision a different license into Office 365. So you begin seeing how, the use cases and the applicability of this expands from just simply, provisioning users in and out of cloud and SaaS services to combining and integrating the access provisioning as well. I'd really hate to have to retool or build up a new service, one, to provision the identity, second, to provision the access, and a third, to audit the access, and a third, or a fourth, when the user's role changes as he moves through the organization, his access needs to be audited, right? Does he have a continual need to have that same level of access within Salesforce or within Box or within AWS now that he's moved out of IT into support, or he's moved out of sales into mergers and acquisitions? So, the users don't really remain static. They change over time. And so looking at, an opportunity like this, hey, look, I'm a big fan of just-in-time provisioning, but to my knowledge, just-in-time provisioning hasn't really solved this problem yet. So you really need to look at different tools to address and respond to the business requirements with regards to, timely deprovisioning, automating and streamlining the audit for a more sustainable audit and compliance approach.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much. And just to take everything one little step further, sort of like the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, we got the ghost of Christmas future coming along here. And giving what you know now, and what I've found about the product and talking with our customers is that you really take off a lot of the limits that people have grown up living with and understanding. The limits that your directory can only have one structural design. The limits that you've limited to protocols that you can use. You can't mix those two things together. They won't talk to each other. So when you've taken off the limits on those areas, you've actually defied gravity in the world of directories. Looking forward, knowing what you know now, where do you see your implementation going? Where do you see the goals in the future coming for both leveraging the technology and basically building on top of it?
It's scary to predict because, the business changes so much that we're usually trying to keep up with what they want. Some things are pretty obvious for us in the sense of the continuing growth. It's key to our identity provider. In my mind, it's more of a cautious future. I don't want virtual directory to become for us what SAML was for the last 10 years in the sense of yet some other mechanism to mask our identity problems. So I'm looking at it from the point of view of helping us get through the migration of identity, the consolidation of identity as we need it, but create enough rules, governance patterns to make sure that we don't become lazy about it as an easy solution to continue, expanding some of these identity silos. So it's a bit of a cautious. It's both, again, similar to SAML, it's a double-edged sword. It's great. It solves problems. It helps the end user experience, but you don't want it to mask the true work that you have to do in the identity consolidation.
I see it as a couple things, especially within the bank for us. We do, again, like I said before, we do synchronization now. So I actually see it as Carlos was saying, the way he does it now is rather than synchronization, we're going to be dynamic on the fly. This is the directory, and we'll be doing linking in behind, using that as our front rather than doing the, twice a day, let's synchronize, let's do this, let's do that. So I see that I see it, and then going on a little bit more about what we were talking about a little bit earlier was about, I see it as attribute-based access control as well. When you're sitting there flying out attributes, and especially if we can do dynamic attributes within it, and they're not in a store, but maybe even create another store or have them dynamic within the tool itself. But having an attribute-based access, simply like I'm a teller at a bank, right? Okay, you get certain things based on that attribute. If you change roles, that attribute changes, right? It's not a group membership anymore. It's not security group. It's not all that legacy, who owns the group. It's an attribute, simple. So this is a great tool just to be able to put the rules in the back, change the attribute on a, dynamic basis. I wouldn't even say hourly, weekly, it's dynamic, right? So I see that as a future piece as well, having those dynamic attribute roles, attributes. Thank you. Jeez.
So, I've picked up, Carlos, you've kind of made that journey from commercial IDP, from an enterprise IAM system. I kind of see that trend and just continuing. What I've identified, in terms of building the enterprise IDP are the three legs. You need identity, you need access, and you need self-service. So I believe you actually have a self-service portal for Radiant One, right? And whether you use the Radiant One self-service portal or you build your own self-service portal, these technologies are really building the foundation for enabling your future with regards to how you design and manage your identities, and if you're designing for ROI and for scale and longevity. Hopefully my wish is that these technologies are going to remain long enough to help you begin leveraging for improving your ROI, like in building self-service use cases around these tools, for integrating and streamlining your governance, risk, and compliance in your audit requirements. So you see the potential, and probably a lot of you have a lot of identity silos or identity provisioning systems. There's overlap, right? So you can begin to rationalize this across the an applications portfolio, and standardize on this model to extend and manage identity from on-prem into the cloud, and from cloud to on-prem, and from cloud to cloud. It becomes a very versatile platform for you to manage.
All right, excellent, thank you. What I'd like to do now is open up the room to questions. We had a fair amount in the last session, and then there's probably a few more questions that have come up since this. You've got an excellent set of experts here, so does anyone have additional questions to ask? No, there we go. 1 second.
Hi, good afternoon. Question to the gentleman to my right, where you said, don't use the virtual directory to hide the problems underneath, which is exactly where you first put the virtual directory in place. How are you going to convince business to clean up the mess, because they don't see the mess anymore because you perfectly masked it? How do you get the money to get it cleaned up because it's solved for them?
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. That's the challenge, and that's why it's taken us a decade to get to the point we are now in the sense of using SAML. So how, it's yet to be seen. Ask me in a year how I'm doing. But a lot of it is really being consolidated around our IDP. It's having a bunch of current silos move toward it, where they're going to have their identities migrated into a single LDAP. So that's the plan. The attributes, which is really where we're using the Radiant Logic for, for that authorization side of it, that's going to be a little tougher because you are dealing with a lot of different relying party applications, and each one has its own kind of authorization rules. So that kind of ties in where we're trying to create a strategy of moving toward externalizing that fine-grained authorization and moving those attributes out of systems, out of proprietary databases, into using the PIP for everything. It's hard. It's going to take some time, but that's what we're trying to evolve toward.
Thank you.
I would actually add to that instead of not using a virtual directory to hide the problems or the mistakes that you've made on the back end. That another strategy would be to use the virtual directory to hide the complexity and the mistakes that you have on the back end, because if you wait to fix all of those before you begin to address convergence or integration or migration, or just in terms of your overall framework for managing, you could be waiting a very long time. So, hopefully the flexibility of, a tool like Radiant One or ICS or VDS gives you that, kind of, moldable and workable solution where you can, as the leaders and the architects within your organization, where the bodies are buried, right? So you can kind of hide that complexity and hide this, the sins of the past, and create, the framework for your future, identity requirements without having to go rip and replace everything on the back end.
Any additional questions? Oh, by all means.
So we're in a compliance area here. So like, for instance, we may have one directory store, right, because that's a sensitive area and there's only certain people authenticating through there. And then with the Radiant Logic product, right, it's going to be a centralized virtual store. How do you manage that segmentation between like a directory store that, is segmented for that reason, and then everything else that doesn't need that level of compliance?
I'll try. At the end of the day, there's governance rules around that, right? In the sense that if you have a separate user repository that has to be separated for reasons, how you control the access to, how you expose it, it's going to be, the virtual directory definitely gives you an attribute level access control to what you expose to make sure it's the minimal, and kind of that extra security layer on top of it. But, if it's within some sort of enclave where you're not supposed to, well, virtual directory isn't really going to help you, because you have regulations, compliance, to your point, that you can't do it anyway. So it really comes down to, and we do things with, we have TRICARE, military healthcare contracts, where we do have a lot of separation. And so we have that where we have, the compliance requirements around some of our identities are such that, yeah, we can never commingle them. There's some aspects of it where some of the NSTIC rules allows us to do, the provider side of it, to have some sort of external IDP, authorize them into that enclave, but not consumers. And so it depends on the regulations, what you could actually get away with. And then once you have those guidelines, sure, the technology gives you that extra layer of security around it, definitely.
I'll add that was the exact use case for when we brought it in. Managing the access to this IDR, to this identity repository. So we brought it in just for that, being able to now give views to all the different. We have a data governance committee who gives, okay, yes, you can have access to these 4 attributes. Yes, you can have access to these. So what we do is, out of that, we create views. Now your functional account, your literal functional account, has access to only see those attributes, nothing more, nothing less, and that was pre-approved by data governance.
There's some additional angles that you could look at this. There's tools around cloud data protection and data encryption. So if you look at the layers that we're building around this are additional kind of hurdles that you have to get to get at the data. With virtualizing directories and attributes, you're creating new products. But additional things you can do are the encryption of the data at rest. If you're regulated or audited, and if you require FedRAMP or HIPAA, you're probably already doing that. But when you think about where are you going to build these, if you're going to build these in AWS or a public cloud service, you probably want to go to an environment that already has that HIPAA stamp of approval or FedRAMP compliance. So you're deploying onto a target system that's going to give you that ability to address your audit requirements.
Excellent. Any other questions from the room? I know we're standing between you and a little relaxation before dinner, so and with that, I will thank you, gentlemen, for your contributions this afternoon.
Thank you.
And everyone for your attendance. Thank you very much.